The last words of Jesus recorded for us in the Gospel of Matthew is what became known as the Great Commission. And he told his disciples, he said, as you go on your way, I want you to make disciples. I need you to teach them to observe all that I have commanded you. And in this day and age, or at least in the church today, we have turned those words into an industry. And we had this idea that discipleship or disciple making is putting people in a class and have them learn more stuff. And that they can go from becoming just a normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill believer, and then the next phase is becoming a disciple. Now, the Bible knows nothing of that. That is not what Jesus had in mind. What Jesus was telling his disciples that I want you to live your life on purpose, because you are going to teach people how to reflect me and how to reflect God the way that you do. And so you want to teach them to observe all that I have commanded you so that you're living your life on purpose, and so that those who follow you will learn what it looks like to reflect me. And this concept of being a disciple maker, so I would argue this, that every person on the planet is a disciple maker. We will all teach others how to reflect God the way that we do, for good or for ill. And we need to be aware of that. And so I want to spend some time as we continue looking at what happened to creation, what happened to this creation, what happened to the world, why we're in the mess that we're in now. And by looking at the lineage of two disciple makers, Seth and Cain, and the legacy that they left for those that came after them. And so next on Digging Deeper, we're going to take a look at the legacy of Adam and Eve. There's an old adage that I have heard many times that goes like this, like father, like son. Have you ever heard that? I find that is sometimes true, actually more times than I would like to admit it to be true. And that I've noticed that many times when I first meet people and different people and if I know their parents, they tend to be a lot like their parents. This is true in my family. My daughter is the spitting image of her mother. In fact, if you want to know what Jane was like when she was 7, all you have to do is look at Megan. And when she was 7, and you probably get a pretty good idea. This is the same true of my boys and me. In fact, I tell them all the time that doesn't make them feel good, that, hey, this is your future, embrace it. And you see, it's true that we do get many of our physical of our mannerisms and physical attributes from our parents. And the same is true with the intangibles. People tend to act like their parents. If children have parents who are open and giving people, then they tend to be open and giving themselves because they are learning from others. And this really hit home to me one time. I can remember back when Jane and I were dating. We would spend half of the major holidays with my family, and then we'd spend the other half of the day with hers. And I remember specifically one Thanksgiving that we went to my cousin's house for dinner. Now, most of my mom's family were there, and I come from a fairly large Irish family, and we tend to be a little bit noisy, and we're also incredibly opinionated. And each one of my family, and I fit in really well. We all believe that everybody else should be dying to hear what our opinion is. And so as you may imagine, there was pretty loud. I was sitting at the cousins' table. We were talking quite a bit, and I remember one of my cousins could not figure out how somebody as smart as Jane would ever be going out with me, and had no problem telling her that at that Thanksgiving dinner. We had a lot of fun. There was a lot. We would argue, we would fight with each other, but in the end, we were family. And so we would always come together, and we did in fact love each other. But after that noisy Thanksgiving time with my family, we then went to Jane's grandparents' house to spend time with them and her parents. And it was a very, very stark contrast. In fact, I think in all the time that we were there, I'm really not sure if more than a half a dozen words were exchanged. Just all kind of sat around, looked at each other, and then smiled or something every once in a while. And it was very quiet. There may have been more talking. It just seemed like it was very quiet. And so in there, we had to learn that well, first of all, Jane had to learn how to deal with a very noisy, sometimes annoying, very opinionated group of Irish people. And I had to learn how to speak less and sometimes keep my mouth shut and just kind of sit there. And I, as you all know, I still struggle with that to this day. And Jane's a little bit quieter than I am. And I think the reason for that is because we are both, in many ways, products of our environment. And as individuals, we tend to respond to certain things based on how we grew up. Now, because our families have an impact on us. In fact, we are who we are because, in many ways, how we're raised, or at least how we perceive how we're raised. And just as it's true that we learn from those that we are around, we also impact those who come after us by our actions. See, who you are today will affect those who come after you tomorrow. This is something that I don't think enough people really spend the time thinking about, but it's a true statement. You will affect the lives of people who come after you, for good or for bad, because people learn by watching their elders. Children learn by watching their parents. They learn how to interact by watching their parents interact with each other and with other people. Now, nowhere is this principle more evident than it is in Genesis chapters 4 and 5. Now, in Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 to 15, the last time we were together, we saw that Adam did in fact have a son who was just like him, a fallen human being who disobeyed God, who sinned, and then tried to duck the responsibility. And when we left last week, we found that Cain had been banished from the sight of the Lord. And where we pick up the story today is that Cain begins his new life by disobeying God's command. In Genesis chapter 4, beginning in verse 16, it says, "And then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, and he settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And then Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And when he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch." So Cain went east of where the rest of the family were, and he took his wife, probably his sister, and he began a family. And then in the course of time, he built a city, and he named it after his son, Enoch. Now, God told him that he was to be a wanderer his entire life. That was to be the consequences of his actions, his punishment for murdering his brother. But Cain decided, I don't want to do that. And he decided to act independently from the Lord, which of course was not a new concept for Cain. And here we find the first city. Now, the first city was built on a faulty premise. God said, don't do it, and Cain did it anyway. And then Moses, after he tells us a little bit and reminds us of who Cain is, he begins to describe Cain's family, the legacy that he leads, those who come after him, beginning in verse 18 of chapter 4. And it says, "To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, and Mehujael fathered Methushael, and Methushael fathered Lamech. And Lamech took two wives. The name of the one was Ada, and the name of the other was Zillah. And Ada bore Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of those who play the lyre and the pipe. Then Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, and he was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. And his sister, the sister of Tubal-Cain, was Naamah. Now Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, 'Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me. a young man for striking me. So if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. Now, understanding who came from whom is not only important in New England where I live or in the Midwest where I moved from, but it's also very important for the Jews. And it is vital when we're studying the book of Genesis, because this is how the book is broken into parts. It's broken into what happened to the family of whatever. So now we're looking at the family of Adam and Eve, or the Toledot of the creation, the Toledot of Adam and Eve. And so Moses is going to describe what became of two family lines. So Cain and the replacement son for the one that he killed, Seth. And in doing so, he's going to make some very important points. Now, the first point that he's going to make is one that we've just looked at. And that is that ungodly people tend to beget ungodly people. Now, again, this should not surprise us. If you're not serving the Lord, you're not going to teach your children how to follow after God. But he makes some interesting observations that I think are important to us, because you see, at the same time that we're seeing this lineage or this legacy of Cain, there was a boon in technological advances. Society was growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, it was just starting out, so it does make sense. But it tells us that Lamech's sons were incredibly talented. I mean, they invented music. One of them invented metallurgy and so on. And so they were incredibly talented men. But they just weren't godly. Now, this does make sense that they would be talented because there were only 7 generations in the fall. In other words, they were able to use much more of their thinking capacities than we are here in 2023. And so they were starting from scratch, and they were incredibly talented, and we had this incredible technological advance that was happening in the world today, or around them. But in just 7 generations, look at how far Cain's line had fallen. I mean, Lamech was a bigamist, which was directly against the order that God set up. God said one husband, one wife, one family. That's been the case since creation. But Lamech was also a twice murderer. Once for a man for hurting him or slighting him or some way, and a boy for striking him, for hitting him. Whether it was done on purpose, whether it was done by accident, we don't know. And then he had the nerve to boast about it, that if Cain is for murdering a man is to be avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times, because I'm 77 times worse? I don't know. But somehow he felt good about what he had done. And so we see the rapid decline of the legacy or the line of Cain. And I want to remind you of something, that just because things seem to be looking good on the outside, it doesn't mean that things really are that good. I mean, just think about our world today. We have many advances today. We have microwave ovens. We have the internal combustion engine. We have airplanes. We have cameras and computers that what I'm recording this podcast on. Incredible technological advances. Yet that doesn't mean that you'll still have godliness going along with it. Because even though we experience so many wonderful things in our world today, we still have sin being rampant in our society. And this is what was true of Cain and his family. Even though incredible things were happening, there was still sin that was going on unchecked, to where ultimately you get this disgusting person named Lamech. So Cain was an ungodly man. He killed out of jealousy, and his family paid the price for his actions. Like begat like. And so compromise begets compromise. Hatred begets hatred. Complacency begets complacency. This is true in homes. It's true in families. It's true in organizations. It's true in governments, in countries, in civilizations, and societies. And I believe this is why we're seeing the problems we're seeing in our world today, because the ungodliness is rampant, and it's just giving birth to more and more ungodliness. And unless something changes and stops the pattern, it's going to continue. So God doesn't leave us alone here. We're not totally depressed here, because the next thing that he shows us is that godly people can beget godly people. And beginning in verse 25 of chapter 4, it says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. And at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. So as we continue in chapter 5, it says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them. And he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and he named his son Seth. Now the days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Now Seth lived after he fathered Enosh for 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan for 815 years, and other sons and daughters. And thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared for 830 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Now Jared lived after he fathered Enoch for 800 years and other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. Now when Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech for 782 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son, and called his name Noah, saying, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work, and from the painful toil of our hands. Lamech lived after he fathered Noah for 595 years, and he had other sons and daughters. And thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So here we find a legacy that after Adam and Eve had another son named Seth to replace Abel, who had been murdered, and it says that when Seth had a son, he named him Enosh, and then the Bible records for us that then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. And so in this account here, Seth was very different from his brother Cain. He was more like his brother Abel. Cain began his adult life, recorded for us, in disobedience. And Seth began his adult life that's recorded for us in godly living. Now, this is very important to our discussion, that Seth was a godly man. In fact, at the time of his son's birth, it says the world, apart from, of course, Cain and his family, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Doesn't tell us what they did, doesn't tell us how they did it, it just tells us they called upon the name of the Lord. And then we see 7 generations from Adam through Seth, we find another man whom Moses gives more than just a passing comment. And we see that recorded for us in verses 21 to 24 in chapter 5. And that man was Enoch. Now, Enoch was a man who, it says, walked with God. And every time I read that, I'm absolutely amazed. It says he actually walked with God. I can't even imagine what it means, actually walking with God. I mean, yes, I walk with God, but not in the same way. Now, we know that Enoch was a godly man. He was one of the few men in Scripture who actually walked with God. And he's one of only 2 men in all of Scripture to not face death, I would argue, yet. And so we see the difference between Lamech and Enoch. And our question is, what was the difference between these two? Well, Enoch's ancestors, it said, called upon the name of the Lord. And I want you to don't underestimate this. For you see, godly people have a better chance of having godly progeny. Not guaranteed, but a better chance of it. Well, now, why is that? Because we affect those who come after us. You see, Adam was only 627 years old when Enoch was born. And Seth was only 497 years old. I say only, but in that time period, it really wasn't that old. But in other words, they were both alive. And I can just hear Enoch learning from Adam about God. I mean, what was he like? What was it like? What did you talk about when you talked in the cool of the day? What did God have to say to you? What words of wisdom did God give you? What was it like after you fell and you had to deal with the very real bit of letting God down and dealing with the consequences of that? How did you handle that, Adam? I mean, he learned from him. Enoch was able to hear firsthand what the beginning was like. In fact, Paul tells us in Romans that faith comes by hearing. And that principle is true. We learn by hearing and seeing others before us. Again, just look at how kids mimic their parents. And I would submit to you that if we live godly lives, our children are more likely to mimic godly habits. So you may be saying, but Dad, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. But which unfortunately, that's true for too many people. But we can learn from the elders and the people that we see at our church. I am a part of who I am today in a large reason because of the godly men that I was able to watch and to look at in the churches that I attended, because I went to church for many, many years when my parents did not go. And some of the best influencers of my life were not my parents, because I didn't always have the best example at home, but I did have incredible examples at church. Now, Proverbs tells us that we are to train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. Now, the author doesn't mean to make a child go to church, and then when he's older, he'll stay in the church. Now, because first of all, it simply hasn't happened, even though many parents have tried it, but that's not what he's saying here. What he's saying is that we are to demonstrate what godly living is all about. That, in other words, we need to give our kids a chance. And especially in this day and age, when our society is going further and further downhill every day, we need to give our children a chance to live a godly life. And we do that by demonstrating what it looks like to live a godly life, to let them know what's going on in the decisions that we make, for example. So, because how do children learn to make God a priority in their lives? Well, they do it by observing their elders, their parents, the people at their church who make God a priority in their life. Steve Green nailed this truth in the song, Find Us Faithful. And the lyrics go like this. So after all our hopes and dreams have come and gone, and our children sift through all we've left behind, may the clues that they discover and the memories they uncover become the light that leads them to the road we each must find. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. May the fire of our devotion light their way. May the footprints that we leave lead them to believe, and the lives we live inspire them to obey. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. And so I would pray that you would ask the question, how am I doing? How am I doing in showing what it means to be a follower of Jesus? Not only to my children, if I have them, or my grandkids, if you're my age, but also to the people that I come in contact, whether it's at work, whether it's at home, whether it's in the church. How am I doing? Because we will make a difference, and we want to have that legacy. We want to have that legacy in the church. We want to have that legacy in our families, the legacy of following God. And the one thing that the scripture points out to us is how important it is that we are intentional in displaying God to those who come after us, because it will have an impact for generations to come. So I thank you for joining me today. I thank you for making it to the end. I pray that you have a wonderful week. Have a fantastic time as you spend time with your other siblings in Christ, worshiping the Lord this weekend. And I look forward to seeing you again in another video. Thanks for watching. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget, smash the like button, hit the notifications. Be sure to subscribe so that you won't miss any of our podcasts. And again, have a wonderful week. I look forward to seeing you again soon. God bless y'all.